Okay.
Our reading this morning is from 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jediah, daughter of Adaiah of Bozkath. He did what was right in the sight of the Lord and walked in all the ways of his father David. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent Shaphan, son of Azaliah, son of Meshullam, the secretary, to the house of the Lord, saying, "Go up to the high priest Hilkiah and have him count the entire sum of the money that has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people. Let it be given into the hand of the workers who have oversight of the house of the Lord. Let them give it to the workers who are at the house of the Lord repairing the house, that is, to the carpenters, to the builders, to the masons. And let them use it to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the house. But no accounting shall be asked from them for the money that is delivered into their hands, for they deal honestly." The high priest Hilkiah said to Shaphan the secretary, "I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord." When Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, he read it. Then Shaphan the secretary came to the king and reported to the king, "Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house and have delivered it into the hands of the workers who have oversight of the house of the Lord." Shaphan the secretary informed the king, "The priest Hilkiah has given me a book." Shaphan then read aloud to the king. When the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. Then the king commanded the priest Hilkiah, Ahikam, son of Shaphan, Akbor, son of Micaiah, Shaphan the secretary, and the king's servant Asaiah, saying, "Go inquire of the Lord for me, for the people, and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our ancestors did not obey the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us." Then the king directed all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem should be gathered to him. The king went up to the house of the Lord, and with him went all the people of Judah, all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the priests, the prophets, and all the people, both small and great. He read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant that had been found in the house of the Lord. The king stood by the pillar and made a covenant before the Lord, to follow the Lord, keeping his commandments, his decrees, and his statutes, with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of this covenant that were written in this book. All people joined in the covenant. Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God.
In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. Amen. It started out as kind of a church do-it-yourself remodeling program. The temple had been built by Solomon, predominantly, primarily, and he had built it over the period of about 50, 60 years. But by the time we actually get to Josiah, we're about 250 years after that. And so, well, the property committee came to Josiah and said, "We have some beams that are kind of starting to fall apart a little bit, and maybe it's time for us." And so Josiah said, "Okay, we'll do it." And President Josiah went in and said, "Let's empty the coffers and we will start this project." And in the midst of the project, as is told in one of the other stories, a piece of the wall fell away. And instead of finding something horrible like dry rot, what they found was a scroll. And the scroll changed everything. Because you see, things really don't change. They really just don't change. You know, we kind of tell ourselves that we are Christians, that we are the church. The church is an institution, right? That is based on the truth. We're based on the book. And if you want to, you can say that we are based on an inerrant and infallible Word of God as put forward by... But in spite of all of our attempts to try to, we drift. We drift. Now, I'm not advocating for inerrant and infallible. What I'm saying is that it doesn't really matter even whether we claim it as inerrant or infallible. Even remember that the Bible itself is a witness to the events that happened there. The Bible itself is them trying to figure out what was going on. And so what we have to do is go even deeper than that. A huge change happened within Judaism. About 500 years, another change called Jesus. Fairly major change. 500 years after that, Phyllis Tickle, wonderful church theologian and historian, says that most major religions will go through what she calls a change or a reformation about every 500 years. So we had Jesus, and then about 500 years after that was the church becoming kind of the state church, and things moving into where it became the established, for better or for worse. You know, there were benefits at the time, but you had to kind of look at it and go. And then about 500 years after that, St. Francis of Assisi trying to pull the church back into getting reconnected with God. And about 500 years after that, Martin Luther, right? Oh yay, there's where we get to step into the picture. Martin Luther really kind of looking at what was going on within the church and saying, we've drifted. We've drifted. And for Luther, the big shock was going back into the original texts. What had happened, and this is a piece that often people don't realize, is that Islam had overwhelmed Constantinople. And all of the people, the scholars, had left Constantinople. They changed its name to... What was that?
Istanbul.
Oh, Istanbul, yes. And anyway, all of those Greek scholars left Constantinople and they fled into Europe. And so all of a sudden you had these people who were in Europe who spoke Greek. And what a shock. Greek was the original language of the New Testament. And Luther started taking Greek from one of these Orthodox scholars. And then he started looking at the Bible and went, Mein Gott! Was hast gedacht? What's happened? This is not what we were taught. It's different. And so Luther wrote it all down. So you would think, right, that writing it all down, we would have it. We have, as the confirmation kids have found, the small catechism, the large catechism, the medium-sized catechism. We have the small called articles. We have the Augsburg Confession. What more do we need? And yet, think about the big change, one of the big changes that's happened over the last 50 years. Communion. Let's use that as an example. When I was growing up, we had communion once a month. We had communion once a month. Some churches had it once a quarter. How many people here when you were growing up was it once a quarter? Some churches had it once a year. Anybody here once a year? The problem is that you see, we started coming into contact and started talking to other Christians. I know that's kind of a radical thing to do. We started talking to other Christians like the Episcopalians and the Roman Catholics and the Presbyterians. And they started to say, well, what do you believe about communion? This is like in the 1960s, the time of the great ecumenical movement, right? And we kind of, quite honestly, we went, we do it. We do what we've practiced. And so we thought to ourselves, you know what, we better go back to Luther and find out what he had to say. And then we wish we hadn't. Because Luther had a lot to say about Holy Communion. Guess how many times That's how often Luther said we should have communion. Daily. We're not there yet, are we? See, Luther said daily, or at minimum, once a week. And all of a sudden, all of us who are going, well, monthly, we're faced with a big decision. Either we buried Luther and forgot that he'd ever said that, or we had to try to live up to it. Now, this is one of those, standing here after 35 years of ministry and looking back to where I started, I never thought, Pastor Boss, that really great and wise mentor of mine, told me, and I told Kevin Beebe too, I said, we think that as pastors, we are at the helm of a great ship, and we are at the wheel, and we turn the wheel this way, and the great ship moves in that direction. And we turn the wheel that way, and the great ship moves in that direction. Pastor Boss said, not at all. He said, we're tugboats in front of a tanker. We'll be up there at the bottom going, and we might get the course to change just a little bit. Communion. You'd think we would have discovered this is what Luther said. You do it at least weekly. Who is welcome at communion? Luther's really clear. Everyone. At that point, you had to be confirmed. Or in some congregations, you had to be 18 before you could take communion. Now, a lot of pastors just kind of went, they buried it. I know this congregation really took it seriously back in the early 70s and started changing. The first shift was to say, well, we can't do it all at once. People will freak out. They were freaking out anyway. But we will move it to the 5th grade. And you know that now, 35 years later, half of the congregations in the ELCA, this was supposed to have been a transition, are still doing 5th grade. Because that became the new norm. When did this congregation move to weekly? It was in the 70s, I think. It was just like, boom, we're going to do it. Did it happen with some ruffling of feathers? And yeah, probably. Change doesn't happen easily. I remember going into my first congregation, and I was part of a team. Pastor Thurl was senior pastor, I was the associate pastor. And Pastor Thurl was he was this Air Force colonel, lieutenant colonel, chaplain that was the head of the congregation. I mean, he was one who you felt like if he turned the wheel, but even he was like a tugboat in front of a tanker. And he viewed me with a certain amount of, because he would often say, okay, Howell. He didn't say that publicly, but in his office. Howell, I know that you're coming out of seminary and you're full of all kinds of new ideas. I want none of them. This issue of communion, he said, we're sticking with 5th grade. Okay? 5th grade. Don't do anything to undercut. 5th grade is good. Until one Sunday, little 4-year-old by the name of Michael Darlene. If people are here for football, Michael Darlene is often here. I wish he was here today. Now he's 35 years old, right? But then he was 4 years old. And the practice at St. Mark was that Chris would come by with the bread, which of course was poker chips, wafers, right? And pass them out. And then I would come along, and I would be kind of cleanup. I was the associate pastor. So I would do the blessing for the kids. The kids could come forward and do the blessings. But then I'd give the wine, too. Well, there we were on Sunday morning. Chris gave the bread to Michael Darlene's mom, skipped over the top of Michael, gave the bread to his dad, David. And Michael reached out like this and cried out in the most incredibly plaintive 4-year-old voice, echoing throughout the whole church, saying, "I want Jesus too!" And Chris just stood there. Then he looked at me, looked back at Michael, and gave him communion. And then we went back into Chris's office and said, "Okay, I'm ready to talk about it." You see, we kind of get this feeling, that's what I really want us to be kind of thinking about today. We kind of get this feeling that we are the people who have arrived. We get this feeling that we are a people who have kind of set the pattern. But really, if you really want to think about it, what we need to be are people who are light on our feet, people who are ready to move, people who recognize that we constantly can be not only looking at new things that are coming our way, but then also going back to our roots and going back to a core belief that's even deeper than the Bible itself. This recognition that God is really a part of our lives, really a part of our lives. That God is not just this idea, that God is not a set of rules and regulations, that God is not off in some distant place far away, but that God is right. That's what God has been trying to get through to us from the very beginning. And somehow we keep drifting away from that very core understanding. That God is with us, that God is love, that God reaches out to all of us, to all people, irrespective of skin color or race or political party or whatever kind of division we want to set up, that God is reaching out to all people, and God really wants the best for every single person on this earth. That's the core. And all this other stuff that we do can be fine. But it can also get in the way. We are, right now, in the middle of a continuing change within the church. Sometimes you feel it a little bit more than others. But think to yourself, okay, if I were to go back 50 years, would I even, what was it Deb Nelson said? If I went back to Minnesota, because sometimes some of those kind of, it's like 50 years ago. But if I were to go back and experience the worship service that I experienced then now, can I recognize the changes? The changes that have been made because we recognize not just the surface of what we do, but we recognize the core, the roots, the depth of what we do. And recognize that sometimes all of this stuff that we build up around it can get us root-bound, can get us choked off, can help us forget why we were here, why we are here in the first place. To be ready. To be ready to ask, why? Why do we do that? And to be ready to learn from the answers. We're marching forward. There's no way around it. But we're marching forward with a really very basic and understandable core to what God is all about. It's not rocket science. It hasn't been. We make it complicated. God doesn't. We exclude.